Hi, I'm Dr. Doug Campbell, and I'm playing chess with death like you do. After this, we're also going to talk about the Black Death and whether it was really a big deal or whether it was just BS. But right now, I've got this bastard right where I want him. In your face, death!
Checkmate, bitch.
Damn. In the 1330s, a new malady appeared. Probably its origins were in Central Asia, and while we are going to be focusing on the impact of what came to be known as the Black Death in Europe, because that's where it was the most devastating, it was a total catastrophe everywhere it spread, and it was a genuinely global pandemic. So it killed lots of people in North Africa, the Middle East, Persia, India, China, where it may have played a decisive role in the collapse of the Yuan dynasty. So it was definitely bad news everywhere. Its first appearance in Europe we can trace to 1347, where it began to spread along trade routes, so from the Black Sea coast to Constantinople, from there to the island of Sicily, to the Italian trading cities, particularly Florence, which was ravaged by it, Avignon in southern France, Paris, the German principalities, Flanders, London, Scotland, Ireland, Scandinavia. And everywhere, the impact was the same. 50% to, in some cases, 2/3 or even more of the overall population died within a matter of months as a result of this plague. So imagine for a second the inhabitants of medieval towns. They witnessed the appalling spectacle of the bodies of entire families being removed from buildings and packed in carts. They see corpses of the dead overflowing the local cemetery. There aren't enough spaces to bury everybody who has died. You have to imagine that proportion of everybody you knew, your friends, your family members, your cherished loved ones, just simply dropping dead with amazing rapidity. On a global scale, then, we are talking about 125 million at a minimum who died as a result of the Black Death, making this the single worst pandemic in all of human history. Now, in terms of what we're dealing with the Black Death, obviously these societies didn't really have any sense of disease as a bacteriological phenomena. They didn't know what was going on. Subsequent research, most of the kind of consensus of medical scientists has been that this was an outburst of a bacterial infection called Yersinia pestis, which was discovered in the 19th century. Although there is still some debate in the scientific community over what exactly this was. The accounts at the time of the various symptoms were not always terribly precise, and you have had some scholars making arguments that this was an outbreak perhaps of anthrax or smallpox or some sort of hemorrhagic fever related to the Ebola virus. I think for the most part, though, the consensus is still that it was Yersinia pestis, although this variety was way more virulent and way more lethal than anything we have seen more recently from this disease. But, bacteria mutate. The thing about Yersinia pestis is it cannot be spread from human to human. Normally what needs to happen for this, the bacteria to be transmitted is for a flea to carry it. Fleas got it from rodents of various sorts. There's some debate over where exactly the strain that was such a problem in the 14th century came from. Rats is the kind of classical hypothesis, but some people also posit marmots, or if you can believe it, even gerbils. Who really knows? But the basic idea is a flea will bite an infected rodent, move to a human being, bite that person, and as they do, pass along the infection. The best case scenario for a human being getting sick from this illness was a variety of the plague often referred to as bubonic plague because it's primarily an infection of the lymph nodes, so people developed swellings around the lymph nodes that in the lingo of the time were called buboes. So kind of lumpy swellings under the armpits or in the groin region or along the neck, filled with foul-smelling pus. That was one of the primary symptoms. As the infection progressed, high fever, joint aches, and for about 80% of the people infected in the 14th century, within the space of about a week, death. And that's the best case scenario. There was another variety called the pneumonic plague, where the infection spread to the respiratory system, essentially the lungs. So there, the main symptoms were once again very high fever, but also a hacking, violent cough, sometimes with bloody phlegm. That variety of the plague was lethal in about 95% of the cases. And as an extra bit of bad news, while normally this infection couldn't be spread from person to person, the pneumonic variety absolutely could. So when people coughed, they could spread the infection very, very easily. And even that wasn't the worst variety. There was also, in rare cases, a version of this referred to as the septicemic plague, where the infection moved directly into the bloodstream and interfered with the ability of blood to clot. So symptoms of this included necrosis. As blood failed to reach the extremities, they would develop gangrene and actually begin to rot. Also dark splotches under the skin as blood seeped throughout the system. And this version was almost 100% lethal. Like if you got this variety, you would die, sometimes within a matter of hours. So all things considered, like mortality of 80% or worse with the various varieties of this. And this was what was spreading from town to town to town throughout the Middle Ages. So you can see why this would have had such a tremendous impact. In terms of responses, in a lot of ways, people during the Black Death responded in ways that human beings typically do under times of stress. Some people threw themselves into acts of extreme religiosity. This must be God punishing society for its sins. Why is this happening? Because we've done something to bring the wrath of the Almighty down upon us. One of the notorious examples of this was the phenomenon of the flagellants. There would be kind of roving bands of penitents who would move from town to town. When they arrived, they would sing hymns as they progressed to the cathedral at the center of the town. And from there, they would strip down to loincloths and essentially bring out their scourges, which were sort of sticks with leather thongs tied to them. At the end of each one of the 3 leather thongs on the stick was a sharp piece of metal, and they would just whip themselves into a bloody frenzy to attempt to atone not just for their own sins, but the sins of their entire society, since they were convinced that this was a divine punishment. In some ways, this was a socially explosive movement, too. It carried with it an implicit criticism of the church that, like, if the Catholic Church was doing its job, we wouldn't be in these straits. So this was more of a popular religious movement than anything else, and often condemned by the church authorities, up to Pope Clement himself, who banned it, which didn't always help. Extreme piety was one reaction. Sometimes people threw themselves into the opposite reaction in acts of extreme hedonism or self-indulgence, figuring, well, you know what? We could be dead tomorrow, so we might as well enjoy life while we're here. So let us eat, drink, and be merry. Let us fornicate. Let us have a good time. Certainly, some scholars have noted that there are some interesting parallels between some of the frenzied dancing described during the era of the Black Death and the somewhat erotically charged actions of the flagellants who were scourging themselves. Unfortunately, another response that is likewise very human in a time of fear or tension is to find somebody to blame. And during the Black Death, unfortunately, the most convenient target was the largest group of quote-unquote outsiders in Christian society, the only non-Christian group that was permitted in some places, the Jews. The charge that was made was that, well, what are the Jews doing? Well, they're using basilisk venom to poison the wells, which, I mean, yeah, we're getting to like Harry Potter territory now with mythical beasts. But, this unfortunately had very real consequences for European Jews at the time. And frequently confessions were extracted from local Jews under pressure of torture. And once a confession was obtained, acts of violence were perpetrated upon local Jewish communities. Jews were rounded up, burned at the stake alive, all sorts of horrific stuff like that. In some cases, local leaders attempted to intervene to try and protect the Jews. Even the Catholic Church at the time condemned a lot of these actions and said, like, look, the Jews are dying of the Black Death too. This doesn't make any goddamn sense. What are you guys doing? You must chill. But again, in the sort of atmosphere of paranoia at the time, we can see in places like, for example, Strasbourg or Cologne or Savoy, massive attacks on Jews, which resulted in, exact numbers are very hard to come by here, but certainly many hundreds of Jewish communities attacked during the Black Death. No less than 80 German Jewish communities totally destroyed, casualties in the tens of thousands. And of course, as we said, like the Jews themselves are also suffering from the Black Death. So in addition to this gruesome pestilence that they have to deal with the same way that everybody else in their society did, they also have to put up with these attacks by anti-Semitic assholes. So for the Jews during the Middle Ages, like literally they could not win. Now, all of that stuff is undoubtedly a real bummer, right? But for folks who were able to make it through this experience, without minimizing for a moment how horrifying it must have been to see so many of your friends and loved ones and the people you cared about die, for the people who lived through the Black Death, there was the possibility for a better society on the other end of it, one with more opportunities. Certainly there have been some scholars who have made the argument that the Black Death played a critical role in setting the stage for the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation. Obviously, one of the things you get after the Black Death is many more opportunities for laborers. Before the Black Death, society was fairly rigidly stratified. It was dominated by the monarchs and the aristocrats below them, by the institutional Catholic Church that maintained feudal labor systems that kind of kept people in their place. The Black Death turned all of that on its head. All of a sudden, there is a severe labor shortage. Whereas before the Black Death, like you had nothing but labor. Afterwards, all of a sudden, workers can sort of set the price for their labor. Whether we are talking about peasants in the countryside or skilled artisans and tradesmen in the cities, all of a sudden there is a lot of demand for their labor. So people can command higher wages for their work. They can also move around a bit more than they could before to find better deals. Women had more opportunities as well. And during the Middle Ages, women always worked. They were always involved in production and economic activity, but there's even more room for that. After so many of their husbands and fathers had died in the Black Death, there is definitely some space for enterprising women to take on a more active role in the medieval economy. Also, we have the emergence of what we might term a more robust urban middle class in the aftermath of the Black Death that is plugging itself into an expanded trade network. A lot of stuff that used to be handled locally now has to be accomplished through trade. So more wealth is flowing into the cities. A lot of people, I mean, it sounds morbid, but they inherited some of the wealth of the people who died in vast numbers during the Black Death. So you've got a kind of upwardly mobile segment of the urban population. And the wealthier they get, the more of a role they want in the power structure. So you've got a society that was more dynamic, more vibrant, and in some ways more egalitarian within certain strictures than it had been before the Black Death. So if we're looking for lessons from all of this, I think the lessons of the Black Death for the 21st century, first of all, obviously pandemics are a scary time, but don't do stupid shit to make it worse. Don't take out your anxieties on disadvantaged groups of people. Just settle down and listen to the medical professionals. Don't take matters into your own hands. Don't believe crazy conspiracy theories. Also, worth noting that even though it is a scary time, sometimes better times are around the corner. That if you can just hunker down and make it through, there is the potential to come out on the other end with a society that was better than what you started with. Now, for recommended reading, John Kelly's The Great Mortality, An Intimate History of the Black Death from 2006 is a nice kind of popular history overview of this very readable, interesting book, well-researched. If we're looking for a slightly more scholarly take on this, David Herlihy's The Black Death and the Transformation of the West from 1997. Herlihy was one of the first scholars to make the sort of argument that the Black Death was not merely a catastrophe, but that it also helped set the stage for further improvements and ultimately for the Renaissance and Reformation. In terms of artistic responses, one of the most fascinating sources from the time, Giovanni Boccaccio's The Decameron, completed in 1353, gives you a view of what it was like to live through the Black Death from somebody who experienced it firsthand in Florence. So fascinating, gripping, and a little disturbing as well. And I would be remiss if I did not also at least recommend the stuff that we were riffing on at the very beginning of this video, Playing Chess with Death. That, of course, was a shout out to Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal from 1953. A fantastic, gripping, interesting movie. So our verdict, was the Black Death B.S.? Obviously not. Come on. This was the most fearsome pandemic in all of human history, and it had far-ranging consequences for the development of Western society. So, important. Definitely not BS. See you later. Be well. Bye.